The first lie ever told about Eleanor Vale was that she was invisible. The second was that she was loyal. And on the night the royal court finally allowed her to speak, both lies collapsed at once. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, if you discovered the people you served were secretly destroying innocent lives, would you stay silent to survive or risk everything to expose them? And if stories of betrayal, forbidden truths, and royal scandals are your kind of escape, subscribe now to Royal Scandal Stories. Because tonight's story only gets darker from here. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. Water crawled down the palace windows like trembling fingers, while inside the grand hall of Blackthorne Estate, nobles drank imported wine beneath chandeliers worth more than most villages. No one noticed the servants unless a glass shattered. No one noticed Eleanor at all, which was precisely how she survived. "Head down, Mrs." Whitmore whispered as they crossed the marble corridor carrying silver trays. "Tonight especially," Eleanor nodded. "Tonight especially, because tonight the Duke of Blackthorne was hosting the Royal Winter Assembly, a gathering so politically dangerous even the king had doubled the palace guard. Nobles from across the kingdom filled the estate, dukes, countesses, military lords, bishops, bankers, and women wearing diamonds bought with the hunger of poorer families. Eleanor had served them for 6 years, long enough to understand one terrifying truth. The higher a person climbed in court, the crueler they became when no one important was watching. A drunken baron once slapped a servant boy so hard the child lost hearing in one ear. A viscountess fired a maid for being too plain to look at. And last winter, a kitchen girl disappeared entirely after claiming she overheard something she shouldn't have. No one investigated. Servants learned quickly. Silence was survival. But Eleanor remembered everything, every name, every conversation, every lie. That was why she frightened people without realizing it. Not because she spoke too much, because she listened. The ballroom doors opened. Music flooded the corridor. 100 nobles moved beneath golden candlelight while violinists performed from the upper balcony. At the center of it all stood Duke Adrian Blackthorne, tall, controlled, unreadable. He wore black formal dress embroidered with silver threading across the shoulders, the kind of elegance only old money could afford. Women watched him constantly. Men feared him quietly, and unlike most nobles, he never drank enough to lose awareness of a room, which made him dangerous. Eleanor lowered her eyes immediately as she entered with the other servants, but not quickly enough. The Duke noticed her, only briefly, yet something in his expression paused. Recognition, not desire, not affection. Recognition, as if he'd seen her somewhere before. Eleanor looked away first, because surviving court life meant understanding something simple. When powerful men noticed you, bad things usually followed. "Wine," snapped Lady Beatrice Ashcombe, shoving her glass toward Eleanor without even looking at her face. Eleanor poured carefully, too carefully. A single drop touched the woman's glove. The Countess froze. The nearby conversation stopped instantly. "My lady," Eleanor began. The slap cracked through the ballroom. Several nobles turned. Lady Beatrice slowly examined her stained glove like it had been poisoned. "You useless creature," she hissed. Eleanor kept her eyes lowered while her cheek burned. Around them, people returned to conversation immediately, because cruelty was ordinary here. "You should be grateful servants are still legal to employ," Beatrice continued coldly. "In some kingdoms, your kind are simply removed." A few nobles laughed softly. Eleanor swallowed hard, not because the insult hurt, because she recognized the man standing beside Lady Beatrice, Lord Edmund Mercer, treasurer to the crown, and one of the men Eleanor had secretly overheard discussing missing tax shipments 2 months earlier. Her stomach tightened. That conversation had ended with a warning. "If the servant girl speaks," Mercer had said quietly, "make sure no one finds the body." She had never forgotten those words. Enough. The single voice silenced the surrounding nobles instantly. Duke Blackthorne stepped forward. Lady Beatrice straightened immediately. "Your Grace." The Duke's eyes moved to Eleanor's reddened cheek, then toward the spilled wine. "That hardly seems worthy of violence." Beatrice forced a smile. Surely discipline inside one's own estate is hardly violence. A, a dangerous silence followed. And for the first time that evening, Eleanor saw something shift inside the Duke's expression. Disgust. Tiny, controlled, but real. "Return to work," he told Eleanor quietly. She bowed quickly. "Yes, Your Grace." As she turned away, Mercer leaned subtly toward Beatrice. "You're becoming careless," he muttered. Eleanor heard it. Her pulse stopped. Mercer's eyes lifted slowly toward her back. The room suddenly felt too warm, too crowded, too dangerous. Eleanor forced herself not to react. Servants survived by pretending not to hear things. But she could feel it now, Mercer watching her, calculating. The orchestra swelled louder as nobles moved toward the dining chamber. And somewhere deep inside Eleanor, instinct whispered the same warning it had whispered for weeks now. You need to leave this palace before they realize what you know. An hour later, the storm outside worsened. Inside the servants' corridor, Eleanor stacked empty crystal glasses with shaking hands. "You're pale," said Thomas, one of the younger footmen. "I'm fine." "You're not fine." She forced a weak smile. Thomas lowered his voice carefully. "You should avoid Mercer tonight." Her eyes snapped toward him. "What?" "He's been asking questions about you." Cold spread through her chest instantly. "When?" "Yesterday, and again tonight." Eleanor's grip tightened around the tray. "Why?" Thomas hesitated. Then quietly, "Because someone told him you were writing things down." Silence. Eleanor's breathing slowed, measured, careful, because it was true. Hidden beneath loose floorboards in her attic room was a journal containing names, dates, transactions, secret meetings, and conversations overheard across 6 years inside Blackthorne Estate. At first, she'd written things down simply to remember. Then servants began disappearing, and the journal became insurance. Proof. A weapon. "You need to burn it," Thomas whispered urgently. But Eleanor stared toward the ballroom doors, toward the powerful people laughing beyond them. And for the first time in years, something inside her changed. Not fear, anger. Because outside palace walls, villages were starving while nobles held banquets worth entire harvests. Children froze during winter while royal officials sold relief funds for profit. And every time someone tried speaking, they vanished. Eleanor suddenly realized something horrifying. Silence had never protected anyone. It had only protected the powerful. A bell rang through the estate. Dinner announcement. Thomas grabbed another tray nervously. "Please tell me you're not thinking of doing something reckless." Eleanor looked toward the grand dining hall, toward Duke Blackthorne, toward Mercer, toward Lady Beatrice, toward the people deciding who suffered while pretending to be civilized. Then quietly, "What if they deserve to be exposed?" Thomas stared at her like she'd lost her mind. And maybe she had. Because the moment a servant stops fearing nobles, the entire system begins to crack. Mid-story commentary C-Day. If you're still watching, comment below. Who do you trust the least so far? Mercer, Lady Beatrice, or the Duke himself? And if this story already feels like a world you can disappear into, subscribe now. These scandals only become more dangerous from here. The dining hall glittered with gold. Long tables stretched beneath candlelight while nobles discussed trade routes, war rumors, and marriages like human lives were chess pieces. Eleanor moved silently between them, pouring wine. Invisible again. Until, "You there," she froze. Duke Blackthorne. The entire nearby table quieted instantly. Eleanor approached carefully. "Yes, Your Grace?" The Duke studied her for a long moment. Too long. "What is your name?" Servants rarely received that question from nobles. "Eleanor, Your Grace. Have you worked here long?" 6 years. Something unreadable crossed his face again. Then Lord Mercer interrupted smoothly. "Interesting thing to ask a servant, Adrian." The Duke didn't look away from Eleanor. "Is it?" Mercer smiled thinly. "In my experience, servants are safest when unnoticed." And there it was. Not a threat, a promise. Eleanor felt it instantly. Mercer knew, or suspected enough to become dangerous. Duke Blackthorne finally looked toward him, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Funny," the Duke said quietly. "I found the opposite to be true." Silence spread across the table. Even Beatrice stopped smiling, because powerful men rarely challenged each other publicly unless something serious was unfolding beneath the surface, and suddenly, everyone could feel it. Something was wrong tonight, very wrong. The Duke slowly leaned back in his chair. Then, calmly, "Eleanor." "Yes, Your Grace." His eyes locked onto hers. "You look as though you've spent years holding your tongue." Mercer stiffened instantly. The Duke continued, "So let us try something different tonight." The room fell silent. Every noble watching now, every servant frozen. Then Duke Adrian Blackthorne spoke the words that would destroy the royal court forever. "You may speak." For 3 full seconds after the Duke spoke, nobody moved. Not the musicians, not the servants, not even Lord Mercer. The entire dining hall sat suspended in a silence, so sharp it almost sounded alive. Eleanor could hear the rain striking the palace windows, could hear candle wax dripping slowly onto silver holders, could hear her own heartbeat pounding against her ribs hard enough to hurt. "You may speak." No noble had ever said those words to her before. Not truly. Servants were expected to answer questions, to obey commands, to disappear politely. But speaking meant existing, and existence inside royal courts was dangerous. Lord Mercer recovered first. He laughed softly into his wineglass. "Adrian, surely we are not entertaining servants now." A few nervous nobles joined the laughter, but Duke Blackthorne did not smile. His eyes remained fixed on Eleanor, waiting, and suddenly she understood something terrifying. This was a test, not for the court, for her. Eleanor lowered her gaze carefully. "Your Grace, I do not believe my thoughts belong at this table." That, the Duke replied quietly, was not the instruction. A ripple moved across the room. Several nobles exchanged uneasy glances, because everyone there understood power. And right now, Duke Blackthorne was deliberately forcing a servant into the center of it. Mercer's voice sharpened slightly. "You place the girl in an impossible position." "No," the Duke said calmly. "I believe the court placed her there long ago." That landed harder than anyone expected. Even Lady Beatrice lost color briefly. Eleanor felt dozens of eyes burning into her skin. One wrong sentence could destroy her. One truthful sentence might destroy everyone else. The Duke leaned back slightly. "Well?" he asked. And in that moment, Eleanor realized something strange. She was no longer afraid of humiliation, only consequences. Slowly, carefully, she lifted her eyes. "If I speak honestly, Your Grace?" Mercer's hand tightened around his wineglass. "Many people in this room will wish I had not." Silence. "Then interesting," murmured the Duke. Mercer stood abruptly. "I refuse to sit through this theater." "Sit down," Blackthorne said quietly. The room froze again, because there was something dangerous about the Duke's voice now. Not loud, not angry. Certain. Mercer slowly sat. But his eyes never left Eleanor, and for the first time she saw genuine fear behind them. That frightened her more than his threats ever had, because powerful men only panicked when they believed exposure was close. The Duke folded his hands calmly. "Go on." Eleanor swallowed hard, then made the worst decision of her life. She told the truth. 3 months ago, she began carefully, winter relief shipments intended for the northern villages disappeared before arriving. Several nobles stiffened immediately. Mercer remained perfectly still. Eleanor continued. The crown publicly blamed weather damage. A bishop cleared his throat nervously. "But the shipments were never lost," Eleanor said. "They were sold." The room erupted instantly. "That's absurd. Impossible. How would a servant know such things?" Eleanor's pulse thundered. But now that she'd started speaking, years of silence were breaking apart inside her faster than she could stop them. "Because servants hear everything," she said. And that line changed the room. Nobles suddenly looked uncomfortable in ways they never had before. Not because a servant was speaking, because they realized servants had always been listening. Eleanor looked directly toward Lord Mercer. "I heard Treasury officials discussing falsified records inside the East Library on October 12th. Mercer smiled coldly. "And naturally, you expect anyone here to believe a maid over royal officials?" "No," Eleanor answered quietly. "I expect them to believe numbers." That shook several people instantly, because innocent people denied accusations emotionally. Guilty people feared documentation. Mercer's eyes narrowed. What numbers? Eleanor hesitated. The journal, hidden beneath the floorboards. Every stolen shipment, every false payment, every secret meeting. She had never planned to use it publicly. But now the room already smelled like blood. There are records, she said carefully. Mercer stood again, this time furious. This is madness. Is it? Said the Duke. Mercer turned sharply toward him. You're encouraging treason because you enjoy humiliating your political enemies. A dangerous stillness spread across Blackthorne's expression. And suddenly, Eleanor understood something whispered about the Duke for years. He hated corruption. Not publicly, not heroically, quietly, personally. Because unlike the others, he looked disgusted by this world instead of entertained by it. Lady Beatrice suddenly spoke. This servant is clearly being manipulated. By whom? The Duke asked. No one answered, because that question carried weight. If Eleanor was telling the truth, someone powerful had helped her, and everyone at the table was now calculating alliances. Eleanor realized the court was beginning to fracture in real time, exactly like kingdoms often do before collapse. Not with war first, but suspicion. The Duke rose slowly from his chair, towering, controlled, impossible to read. Perhaps, he said calmly, we should hear everything before deciding whether the girl is lying. Mercer's face darkened. You would risk destabilizing the crown over the words of a servant? Blackthorne stepped closer. No, he replied quietly. I would risk destabilizing corrupt men pretending to be the crown. The silence after that felt enormous, because everyone knew he'd crossed a line, and there was no uncrossing it. Outside, thunder shook the estate. Inside, servants pretended not to stare while nobles whispered like frightened animals sensing smoke before fire. Eleanor stood frozen beside the table. She should have stopped already. Any reasonable person would have. But something dangerous was happening inside her now. For years, she'd watched powerful people ruin lives while everyone else lowered their heads and called it order. And suddenly, she couldn't bear it anymore. The Duke looked toward her again. What else do you know? Mercer slammed his hand against the table. This ends now. Several guards entered immediately. The entire room shifted. Eleanor's stomach dropped. Of course, this was the moment. Not humiliation. Elimination. Mercer pointed directly toward her. Arrest her. Two guards moved instantly. But before they reached her, stop. The Duke's voice cracked through the hall like steel. The guards froze mid-step. Mercer stared at him in disbelief. You cannot be serious. Blackthorne's eyes remained on the guards. Touch her without my permission, he said softly, and I will personally see both of you removed from royal service before sunrise. Neither guard moved again. Mercer's composure finally cracked. You're protecting a servant over the court itself. No, said the Duke. I'm protecting a witness, and that word changed everything. Witness. Not maid, not servant, witness. Suddenly this wasn't gossip anymore. It was political danger. Eleanor realized her legs were trembling, not from fear, from adrenaline. Because somewhere deep down she understood the truth. There was no surviving quietly after tonight. Either the court would destroy her, or she would expose all of them first. Near midnight. Dinner had dissolved into chaos. Half the nobles wanted Eleanor imprisoned immediately. The other half wanted to know whether Mercer's missing treasury records were real. And Duke Blackthorne? He watched everyone, silently, like a man measuring enemies. Eleanor stood near one of the palace columns, trying to steady her breathing when the Duke approached unexpectedly. Up close, he seemed even more intimidating. Not because he looked cruel, because he looked tired, the kind of tired, powerful men wore when they'd spent years losing faith in people. You should have fled weeks ago, he said quietly. Eleanor blinked in shock. You knew? Not specifics. Only enough to recognize fear. He glanced briefly toward Mercer across the hall. That man has buried problems before. Cold crept down her spine. People? The Duke didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. Eleanor looked at him differently then. Not as a noble, as a man trapped inside the same rotten system. You hate them, she realized softly. A faint, humorless smile touched his face. You say that as though I'm not one of them. Aren't you? That question lingered between them. and for the first time all evening, the Duke looked almost human. Then suddenly, glass shattered somewhere nearby. A scream followed. Everyone turned. One of the younger servants had collapsed near the wine station. Foaming at the mouth, the room erupted into panic. Eleanor rushed forward instinctively. The servant boy's breathing was shallow, terrified. His fingers clawed weakly against his throat. Poison. Her blood ran cold instantly. The Duke crouched beside them. Who served him? Nobody answered. Because everyone understood what this meant. Someone had already moved to silence witnesses. The servant boy grabbed Eleanor's sleeve desperately. His lips trembled. Then barely audible, Mercer. And then his body went still. Dead silence filled the hall. Lord Mercer slowly stepped backward. The Duke rose carefully, and whatever restraint had existed in the room before vanished. Because now this was no longer scandal. It was murder. Blackthorne turned toward Mercer with terrifying calm. No one leaves this estate. Mercer's face changed instantly. The nobles realized it at the same moment Eleanor did. The court was officially at war with itself. And trapped inside Blackthorne Palace, someone else was still hunting witnesses. No one touched the body for nearly a minute. The young servant lay motionless across the marble floor, while nobles stood frozen around him, like painted statues, suddenly terrified of becoming human again. Rain hammered the palace windows. Thunder rolled across Blackthorne Estate. And somewhere beneath the fear spreading through the hall, Eleanor realized something horrifying. This had escalated far beyond corruption. Someone was killing people now. Lord Mercer recovered first. "Remove the body," he ordered sharply. No. The Duke's voice cut through the room instantly. Mercer turned slowly. "Excuse me." Duke Blackthorne descended the dining platform with controlled calm, though Eleanor could see rage tightening beneath every movement. "No one touches him until the palace physician arrives. He was a servant," Mercer snapped, "not a prince." Blackthorne stopped directly in front of him. "And yet," the Duke said quietly, "he died faster than any prince here tonight." "Silence!" Several nobles visibly shifted away from Mercer. Because people feared corruption. But murder? Murder made even powerful people nervous, especially when witnesses remained alive. Eleanor stared at the dead boy's hand still curled near her skirt. Only minutes earlier he'd been breathing. Now he was evidence, and if Mercer truly ordered the poisoning, then everyone inside the palace was in danger, including her. The Duke turned toward the guards lining the walls. "Seal the estate." One hesitated nervously. "Your Grace, without royal authorization. You have mine." Mercer stepped forward immediately. "You overreach yourself." Blackthorne's eyes darkened. "A servant has been murdered inside my home. Allegedly murdered." The Duke's expression changed then. Not loudly, not dramatically, but something cold settled into his face that made the nearby guards instinctively straighten. "You seem deeply concerned about semantics tonight, Mercer." The treasurer smiled thinly. "And you seem eager to create chaos." "No," said the Duke quietly. "You created chaos the moment you decided poor people were disposable." The room fell silent again. Eleanor noticed something important then. The nobles were beginning to split into sides. Not openly, not yet. But subtle things revealed it. Where they stood, who they looked at, who they avoided. Courts always fractured slowly before they collapsed completely. And tonight, cracks were spreading everywhere. An hour later, Blackthorne Palace no longer felt like a royal estate. It felt like a prison. Guards sealed every entrance. Servants whispered through corridors. Nobles gathered into nervous clusters, drinking wine they no longer enjoyed. And Eleanor sat alone inside a small servant chamber, trying not to panic. The poisoned boy's final word repeated endlessly in her mind. "Mercer." A soft knock startled her. She turned instantly. The door opened. Duke Blackthorne entered alone. No guards, no attendants, just him. Eleanor stood immediately. "Your Grace, you should stop calling me that when we're alone." She blinked. "What?" A faint exhaustion crossed his face. "You sound terrified every time you say it." Because she was. He studied her quietly for a moment. "You've been carrying this alone for years, haven't you?" The gentleness in his voice unsettled her more than anger would have. Eleanor crossed her arms tightly. "I didn't have a choice." "You did. that sharpened her expression instantly. With respect, you're Adrian. She stared. No servant addresses nobles by name. No servant exposes the royal court either. Despite everything happening around them, the line almost pulled a laugh from her. Almost. The Duke moved toward the window overlooking the storm. When my father held this estate, he said quietly, servants vanished often. Eleanor's stomach tightened. He told us they stole from him. The Duke looked down at the rain. I believed him when I was young. Something heavy entered the room then. Not tension, confession. Eleanor watched him carefully. When did you stop believing? Blackthorne's jaw tightened slightly. The winter my mother disappeared. Her breath caught. The royal court had whispered about Duchess Helena Blackthorne for years. Some claimed illness, others claimed scandal. But no one actually knew what happened. The Duke's voice lowered. She discovered treasury records tied to the crown. Eleanor froze. She confronted people she should not have confronted. The storm cracked outside violently. And 3 days later, he finished quietly, she vanished. A chill crawled down Eleanor's spine. You think they killed her? I think, he said carefully, the court protects itself before anything else. That sentence landed with devastating weight because it felt true. Not just in royal courts, in governments, corporations, politics, even modern institutions people trusted blindly. Power rarely destroyed itself voluntarily. It consumed threats instead. Eleanor slowly realized the Duke had spent years watching the same corruption she had, only from the inside. You've been investigating them, she whispered. He didn't deny it. Mercer was never acting alone. Who else? The Duke looked directly at her, and for the first time that night, he seemed uncertain. That, he said quietly, is what frightens me. Mid-story CTA. Right now. Do you think Duke Blackthorne can actually be trusted? Or is he manipulating Eleanor for his own revenge? Comment below, because the truth about the Duke is far more dangerous than it seems.
What makes this story unforgettable isn't just the scandal. It's the reminder that even the most powerful kings fall apart when fear becomes more important than justice. Eleanor was only a servant, invisible to almost everyone around her. But in the end, one voice was enough to expose an entire court built on lies. If this story moved you, comment. Truth always survives. And subscribe to Royal Scandal Stories for more emotional historical dramas filled with betrayal, revenge, forbidden romance, and shocking royal secrets. Because the next story may be even darker than this one.
Near midnight, the palace physician confirmed the poison. Deliberate, fast-acting, rare, the kind accessible only to wealthy officials. Panic spread through the nobles immediately, because suddenly everyone feared becoming the next victim. Eleanor stood beside the upper balcony, watching chaos consume the ballroom below, when Thomas approached hurriedly. You need to come. What happened? I found something. His face had gone pale. Eleanor followed him quickly through the servant corridors toward the lower archives beneath the estate. The deeper they descended, the colder the palace became. Finally, Thomas stopped outside a locked storage room. I saw one of Mercer's men enter earlier. How did you get inside? He held up stolen keys nervously. I shouldn't have. No, Eleanor whispered. You definitely shouldn't have. But he unlocked the door anyway. Inside, the room smelled of damp paper and dust. Boxes lined the walls. Financial ledgers, trade records, shipment manifests, and near the center table sat several burned documents, recently burned. Thomas handed her a surviving page. Eleanor scanned it quickly, then froze. Winter relief shipments, amounts, routes, royal authorization seals. But what stopped her breathing was the signature at the bottom. Not Mercer's, the Crown Regent's. Her hands went cold instantly. No, Thomas looked terrified. What does it mean? Eleanor stared at the seal. It means Mercer isn't the highest person involved. Footsteps echoed suddenly above them. Both froze. Voices guards. Thomas whispered urgently, They're coming. Eleanor grabbed the surviving papers quickly. Go. What about you? I'll distract them. No chance. Thomas. The fear in her voice finally silenced him. Because they both understood something now. Anyone connected to those documents was already marked for death. The footsteps grew louder. Eleanor shoved the papers beneath her dress. Run. Thomas disappeared through the rear passage just as the storage door burst open. 3 guards entered, and behind them, Lord Mercer. He looked almost calm again, which somehow made him more frightening. His eyes settled on Eleanor instantly. There you are. She forced herself to stay steady. I was cleaning storage inventory. At midnight? Mercer stepped closer slowly. You've caused extraordinary trouble tonight. Eleanor's pulse hammered. But she noticed something strange. Mercer looked nervous too, because he knew she'd seen something. You're frightened, she realized quietly. His expression hardened instantly. You mistake patience for fear. No, she said. I think you're terrified the wrong secret survived. That hit him. She saw it clearly. For one dangerous second, the polished royal official disappeared, and a desperate man emerged beneath. Mercer dismissed the guards with a glance. Wait outside. The moment they left, the room changed completely. No witnesses now. No performance. Just predator and prey. Mercer stepped closer. You should have remained invisible. Eleanor backed slowly toward the table. You murdered that servant boy. He was unfortunate. Rage exploded through her chest. Unfortunate? He heard something inconvenient. The casualness of it horrified her. Not because powerful people committed evil, because they justified it so easily. Mercer lowered his voice. Do you know what happens to kingdoms when ordinary people stop trusting institutions? Eleanor stared at him. Truth matters. No, Mercer replied coldly. Stability matters. And there it was. The lie powerful people always told themselves. That corruption was necessary. That ordinary people were too dangerous to know reality. That protecting the system mattered more than protecting innocence. Mercer moved closer again. You think exposing us saves people? His eyes darkened. It destroys them first. Suddenly, Eleanor understood something terrifying. Mercer genuinely believed he was protecting the kingdom. That was what made men like him truly dangerous. Not greed. Conviction. Then, the storage door burst open again. Duke Blackthorne entered, armed guards behind him. Mercer stepped back instantly, and for the first time that night, the Duke looked ready to kill someone. His eyes moved from Mercer to Eleanor, to the hidden documents scattered across the room. Then slowly, what exactly, he asked. Have you two discovered? The room went silent the moment Duke Blackthorne entered. Not ordinary silence. The kind that arrives right before violence. Mercer stepped backward immediately, masking panic beneath irritation. Adrian, he said sharply, this servant has stolen confidential crown records. The Duke's eyes moved toward Eleanor. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat. The papers hidden beneath her dress suddenly felt heavier than iron. Blackthorne spoke calmly. What records? Mercer answered too quickly. Financial documents irrelevant to her station. That alone told the Duke everything. Eleanor saw it happen in real time. The shift in his expression, the calculation, the realization. Mercer was afraid. And powerful men only feared evidence. The Duke extended his hand toward Eleanor. Give them to me. For one terrifying second, she hesitated. Not because she distrusted him entirely. Because trust inside royal courts was how people died. Blackthorne noticed. His voice lowered slightly. If I intended to hand you over, Eleanor, I would have done it hours ago, Mercer snapped immediately. You are emotionally compromised. The Duke ignored him. Eleanor slowly removed the folded documents. Blackthorne scanned the top page once, then again, and all color quietly disappeared from his face, because now he'd seen it too. The royal authorization seal, the Crown Regent's signature, not rumor anymore, proof. Mercer realized the exact moment the Duke understood. Careful, he warned softly. And suddenly the atmosphere changed, because this was no longer about missing funds, or dead servants, or even corruption. This reached the throne itself. The guards escorted Mercer from the archives under direct order from Blackthorne. But Eleanor noticed something deeply unsettling before he left. Mercer smiled. Not confidently, not arrogantly, knowingly. Like a man who believed the palace would soon belong to him again. That smile stayed with her long after he disappeared upstairs. The Duke waited until the guards left before speaking. You should not have found these. Eleanor crossed her arms tightly. I didn't plan to. No, he murmured. None of us did. He reread the documents slowly. Shipment diversions, false treasury approvals, disaster relief funds rerouted to private estates, and every trail led upward, not toward rogue officials, toward the Crown Regent himself. Eleanor leaned against the cold stone wall. What happens now? The Duke looked at her directly. That depends on how badly the Regent wants these records buried. Fear slid through her stomach. You think he'll come here? Blackthorne folded the papers carefully. I think he already knows. Thunder shook the palace above them. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Eleanor truly understood the scale of what they'd uncovered. This wasn't corruption hidden beneath the kingdom. It was the kingdom. Upstairs, panic had infected the court completely. Nobles whispered behind wineglasses. Servants avoided eye contact. Guards doubled along every corridor. The estate no longer resembled a royal gathering. It resembled a government collapsing from the inside. Eleanor followed the Duke into a private study overlooking the eastern gardens. The room surprised her. Unlike the rest of the palace, it lacked extravagance, no excessive gold, no giant portraits, no pointless luxury, just books, maps, documents, a working room. You actually use this place, she said quietly. A faint, humorless smile crossed his face. Occasionally, I enjoy behaving like a useful aristocrat. Despite herself, Eleanor almost smiled. Then she noticed a painting near the fireplace. A woman dressed in deep blue silk standing beside a younger version of the Duke. His mother, Duchess Helena, the missing Duchess. Eleanor stepped closer slowly. She looks kind. Blackthorne went still behind her. She was dangerous. Eleanor turned. The Duke stared at the portrait carefully. People confuse kindness with weakness. My mother never did. His voice softened slightly. She listened to servants, remembered names. Paid debts families forgot existed. That sounds rare among nobles. It was. Something painful moved behind his eyes. She believed power should protect people. Eleanor glanced toward the portrait again, and that got her killed. The Duke was silent for several seconds. Then quietly, I don't believe she died. Eleanor looked back sharply. What? Blackthorne approached the fireplace slowly. When my mother vanished, no body was recovered, no funeral held. No witnesses confirmed anything. Then why claim she was dead? Because the court needed the scandal buried. A chill crept across Eleanor's skin. You think they imprisoned her? I think, he said carefully, she learned something powerful people could not afford to survive. The room suddenly felt colder, because Eleanor realized something terrifying. History was repeating itself. A woman discovers corruption. The court moves to silence her. Everyone else pretends not to notice. The same pattern, again and again. Even in modern times, people still watched powerful institutions bury whistleblowers while publicly denying everything. The methods changed. The system never really did. At this point, do you think the Duke's mother is still alive? Or did the Crown silence her years ago? Comment below. And subscribe to Royal Scandal Stories, because the truth about Duchess Helena changes the entire kingdom. A sudden knock interrupted them. Thomas entered breathless. Your Grace, there's trouble downstairs. What kind of trouble? Thomas swallowed hard. Mercer's men are arresting servants. Eleanor's stomach dropped. What? They're claiming palace staff helped steal crown documents. The Duke moved instantly. By the time they reached the lower hall, chaos had erupted completely. Servants lined the walls under armed guard while nobles watched from balconies above like spectators at an execution. Mrs. Whitmore stood trembling beside two kitchen girls in tears. Thomas clenched his fists beside them. And near the center staircase stood Mercer, calm again, controlled again, deadly again. You cannot arrest innocent staff to protect yourself, Blackthorne said sharply. Mercer turned smoothly. I am protecting the crown. No, Eleanor snapped before stopping herself. You're protecting yourself. Every eye in the hall shifted toward her. Mercer smiled thinly. And there she is. He stepped toward the gathered nobles. This is precisely why order matters. His voice carried through the estate effortlessly. One frightened servant spreads accusations, and suddenly institutions collapse. Several nobles nodded uneasily, because fear was working. Mercer continued, do you think kingdoms survive through emotion, through outrage? Through moral purity, he gestured toward the terrified servants. Stability requires sacrifice. Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. You murdered a boy. Mercer's eyes locked onto hers. One boy. The casual cruelty of it hit the room hard. Even some nobles looked disturbed now. But Mercer pressed on. Do you know how many riots famine causes? How many rebellions begin when peasants believe the crown is weak? His voice darkened. People need faith in authority. The Duke stepped forward slowly. No, he said quietly. They need justice. Mercer laughed coldly. Justice is a luxury stable governments pretend to afford. And there it was again, the philosophy beneath corruption. Fear disguised as leadership. The belief that ordinary people could not handle truth. Mercer turned toward the nobles. If these accusations spread beyond this estate, the kingdom fractures overnight. One lord spoke nervously. Perhaps this matter should remain private. Another agreed immediately, and Eleanor felt something break inside her, because suddenly she understood the ugliest truth of all. Most people did not support corruption because they were evil. They supported it because exposure frightened them more than injustice. Mercer saw hesitation spreading. He pressed harder. The crown regent arrives by dawn. Silence exploded through the room. Several nobles paled instantly. The regent himself. Coming here. Mercer looked toward Blackthorne. You understand what that means? The Duke's jaw tightened. Yes. He understood perfectly. Once the regent arrived, this stopped being a scandal. It became an official purge. Mercer's smile returned slowly. And when he does, every servant connected to this conspiracy will disappear. Mrs. Whitmore began crying quietly. Thomas looked sick. Eleanor felt pure rage flooding through her chest. These people are innocent. Mercer shrugged lightly. Innocence has never protected anyone. The line hit harder than he intended. Because it was true. Painfully true. And that honesty made him terrifying. Then suddenly, a voice echoed from the upper balcony. That's enough. Everyone looked up instantly. An elderly woman stood near the staircase, shadows gripping the railing tightly. The entire hall froze. Mercer lost color immediately. Blackthorne looked like he'd seen a ghost. Eleanor stared upward in confusion. Then the Duke whispered the impossible. Mother, the woman stepped fully into candlelight. Older, weaker, but unmistakably noble, and very much alive. Gasps erupted across the hall. Mercer staggered backward, because standing above the royal court was Duchess Helena Blackthorne. The woman the crown claimed died 15 years ago. For several endless seconds, nobody in Blackthorne Palace breathed. Duchess Helena Blackthorne stood above the royal court like a ghost dragged out of history itself. Older now. Silver threaded through her dark hair. One hand trembled slightly against the balcony rail. But her eyes, sharp, alive, unafraid. And the moment Lord Mercer saw her, his composure shattered. No, he whispered. The Duke stared upward in complete disbelief. Eleanor had never seen emotion break through him before, not real emotion. But now it hit all at once. Shock, grief, rage, hope. Mother. The Duchess descended the staircase slowly, while nobles parted instinctively around her. Some looked terrified. Others looked guilty. A few looked like they were witnessing the end of the world. In a way, they were. Because secrets only survive while witnesses stay buried. And the court's deadliest witness had just returned. Mercer recovered first. You were supposed to remain hidden. The room went still. Too still. Because he'd said it without thinking. The Duchess stopped halfway down the staircase. And there it is, she said quietly. The truth finally escapes by accident. Mercer's face drained instantly. Eleanor realized everyone in the hall understood what that sentence meant. The crown had lied. For 15 years, the Duke stepped forward slowly. You knew she was alive. Mercer straightened again desperately. She was unstable. Helena laughed softly. Not kindly, a yes. The favorite word powerful men use when women discover inconvenient truths. Several noble women visibly looked away. Because even centuries later, the tactic remained painfully familiar. Discredit, silence, isolate. The methods never changed. The Duchess reached the bottom of the staircase at last, then looked directly at her son. I'm sorry. Blackthorne's voice nearly broke. They told me you abandoned us. I know, and I believed them. A painful silence followed. Then Helena gently touched his face. That was the point. The Duke closed his eyes briefly. And for the first time in the entire story, Eleanor understood something important. Adrian Blackthorne had not grown cold naturally. The court had made him that way. Outside, dawn slowly approached through the storm clouds. Inside Blackthorne Palace, the court was collapsing in real time. Nobles whispered frantically. Servants stared openly now. Guards no longer seemed certain who they served. And then the palace doors opened. Every head turned instantly. The crown regent had arrived, tall, elegant, calm beyond reason. That calm frightened Eleanor more than Mercer ever had, because truly dangerous people rarely appeared emotional. The regent removed his gloves carefully as armed royal guards entered behind him. No panic, no confusion, just control. His eyes scanned the hall once, then settled on Helena. A faint smile crossed his face. You should have stayed hidden. The Duchess held his gaze. And you should have remembered that truth survives longer than fear. The regent sighed softly. This kingdom was stable before tonight. Eleanor spoke before she could stop herself. Stable for who? Every eye shifted toward her. The regent studied her carefully. Not with anger, with disappointment. You're the servant. That servant exposed you. A dangerous silence followed. Then, surprisingly, the regent smiled. You think corruption begins with greed, he said calmly. But kingdoms collapse from panic long before greed destroys them. Mercer quickly stepped beside him. Your Majesty, the documents must be recovered immediately. The regent ignored him. Instead, he looked toward the terrified nobles surrounding the hall. Do you know what happens when common people lose faith in institutions? No one answered. Markets fail, armies divide, riots begin. Foreign powers invade. His eyes hardened slightly. Truth is rarely as noble as idealists imagine. Eleanor realized something horrifying then. He believed every word, just like Mercer. That was the true danger of corruption, not villains twirling mustaches, but intelligent people convincing themselves evil was necessary. The regent looked toward Helena. You forced difficult decisions. You stole relief funds from starving villages. I preserved national stability. You murdered people. I protected the crown. The entire room felt suffocating now, because this wasn't merely politics anymore. It was philosophy, fear versus accountability, control versus truth. And for generations, fear had been winning. The Duke stepped forward suddenly. No more. The hall quieted instantly. Blackthorne moved beside Eleanor now, beside the servants, beside his mother, and symbolically, away from the court. I spent years believing silence preserved order, he said quietly. His eyes moved across the nobles. But silence only protected monsters who learned how to speak elegantly. That line hit the room like a blade, because many of them knew it was true. The regent's expression finally cooled. Careful, Adrian. No, said the Duke. You be careful. And for the first time all night, the regent looked uncertain, because something irreversible had happened inside Blackthorne Palace. The servants were no longer afraid. Eleanor noticed it everywhere now. Mrs. Whitmore standing straighter, Thomas refusing to lower his eyes, kitchen staff whispering openly. Fear was losing control of the room, and once fear disappeared, systems built on intimidation began collapsing fast. Then the Duchess spoke again. There's one final truth you haven't told them. Mercer stiffened instantly. The regent slowly turned toward her. Helena faced the court fully. The missing treasury funds were never merely stolen. Silence spread. She pointed toward Mercer. He used them to finance private military contracts beyond crown authority. Gasps exploded across the ballroom. Several nobles stepped backward immediately. Even the regent looked shocked. Mercer snapped furiously. She lies. But Helena continued. He planned to manufacture civil unrest, then seize emergency political control during the crisis. Eleanor felt cold all over. Not corruption anymore. A coup. Mercer's face twisted. You naive fools, he spat suddenly. There is no stable kingdom without men willing to make difficult choices. No, Eleanor said quietly. There's no stable kingdom when powerful men stop believing laws apply to them. That line silenced the room. Because deep down, everyone knew that was how societies actually collapsed. Not from ordinary people demanding fairness, from elites believing accountability was optional. The regent slowly looked toward Mercer. And for the first time, Mercer realized he was no longer protected. "You acted beyond my authorization," the regent said coldly. Mercer stared in disbelief. "You're abandoning me?" "You became reckless." Rage exploded across Mercer's face. "You think they'll spare you?" he shouted. He pointed wildly toward Eleanor. "She already exposed the crown. The people will never trust any of you again." And perhaps that was the most honest thing spoken all night. Trust, once broken, rarely returns unchanged. Royal guards seized Mercer moments later, while nobles erupted into terrified arguments around them. Some fled the hall entirely. Others begged the regent for protection. But Eleanor barely heard any of it. Because outside the palace windows, morning sunlight was finally beginning to break through the storm. Hours later, Blackthorne Estate stood strangely quiet. Mercer had been taken into custody. The regent publicly announced treasury investigations. Several nobles resigned before accusations could reach them. And for the first time in years, servants walked through palace corridors without lowering their heads. Eleanor stood alone in the eastern gardens, watching sunrise spill across the wet stone paths. "You changed the kingdom tonight." She turned. Duke Blackthorne approached slowly. "No," she said softly. "The kingdom was already broken." A faint smile touched his face. "Fair point." For a moment, neither spoke. Then the Duke looked toward the awakening city beyond the hills. "What will you do now?" Eleanor thought about it honestly. The answer surprised even her. "Speak." The Duke glanced at her. She smiled faintly. "For years, people like me survived by staying invisible." Her eyes moved toward the palace. "Maybe that's the real reason powerful people fear ordinary voices." Blackthorne looked at her differently then. Not as a servant, not even as a witness, as an equal. And somewhere inside the palace behind them, bells began ringing across the kingdom. Not for war, not for mourning, for change. If you made it to the end of this story, comment. Truth always survives. And subscribe to Royal Scandal Stories for more cinematic tales of forbidden love, betrayal, revenge, and royal secrets. Because the next scandal may be even darker than this one.
You know what makes stories like this so dangerous? It's not just the corruption. It's how believable it feels. Because throughout history, and even today, powerful people have always depended on one thing: silence. And the moment ordinary people stop staying silent, entire systems begin to crack. So, before we continue, I want to ask you something. Do you believe truth always wins in the end? Or do powerful people usually escape consequences? Comment below. I genuinely want to know your thoughts. And if you're enjoying this story so far, subscribe to Royal Scandal Stories for more cinematic tales of betrayal, forbidden love, and royal secrets.